Hello, everyone, and welcome to the University of Washington Taiwan Studies YouTube channel, where we're presenting a series of interviews and conferences with people who can introduce us to the varied and rich fields that constitute Taiwan studies today. My name is Steve Harrell. I'm retired from the University of Washington, from the Anthropology Department and the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences. And I had done research in Taiwan since 1968. And we're honored to have as our guest tonight Professor Rovaniyaw Lenglengman, also known as Professor Zhang Xiwen, from the Department of Indigenous Research and Development at Donghua University in Hualien, Taiwan. And so maybe we could start out by you introducing yourself, and maybe the best way to introduce yourself is to tell us why you have two names.
Okay. Good morning, everyone in Taiwan. Good morning, Taiwan. Good evening in Seattle. My name is Lenglengman Rovaniyaw. I'm a Taiwan Indigenous Assistant Professor in the Department of Indigenous Affairs and Ethnic Development at the National Donghua University in Taiwan. My hand name is Xiwen Chen. In fact, I don't prefer my hand name because of the lack of history behind it. The last name Chen came from the time after the Japanese colonial government retreated from Taiwan. To register citizens into the hukou system, they had to create artificial last name for indigenous peoples, and therefore my ancestors got a random last name. So for me, this Han last name does not carry any special meaning, nor does it symbolize the history behind my family. If one is familiar with Taiwan naming culture, just by hearing my name, one will know which settlement, which social status, and the history behind my family. Giving back indigenous people's last name is an important movement. Starting from 1980s, it's very meaningful.
So I think a lot of our listeners will know that Taiwan has indigenous population, but not know maybe as much about it as they would like to. So I thought maybe we could start out by you talking just a little bit in general about indigenous people in Taiwan today. And first, maybe just who are the indigenous people? Where do they come from? How many of them are there?
Okay. From the national census in 2019, Taiwan has at least 0.57 million in the category of the indigenous population, consisting of 2% of the total population. Currently, there are only 16 official indigenous groups that are recognized. In addition to that issue, many indigenous people have migrated to urban areas due to lack of opportunities in employment, healthcare, and education. There are about 46% of the indigenous population living in urban areas right now.
And I think a lot of people, they hear the term indigenous, they hear the term aborigine, they hear the term mountain people, and there are a lot of different terms in the Chinese language as well. So what are the best words for us to use?
Mm-hmm. Within Taiwanese indigenous experts and the scholars, the consensus is that the word indigenous is generally neutral, and Aboriginal carries a negative connotation of uncivilized or uncultivated. However, indigenous and Aboriginal are still just English words. Subsequently, it does not impact the indigenous population as much as how the local language here has evolved. Now, let's go over is a long history of the impact certain terms has had on the indigenous people. During the Qing dynasty, indigenous people are still segregated by geographical and cultivation labels. Cultivative and uncultivated people, we call it 生番 or 熟番, are labels for those who live higher or lower altitudes, and cultivation labels at that time. Until the period of Japanese imperial rule, Taiwan indigenous people continue to be segregated based on two criteria, geography and cultivation. However, is now separated into mountain people and plains people. We call it the 高山族 or 平埔族. And after World War II, the ROC government deemed plains people, or those who live at lower altitudes, assimilated into the Han culture. Therefore, it has been difficult to categorize 平埔族, plains people, into indigenous people. On the other hand, mountain people, or those who live in a higher altitude were officially confirmed by the ROC government to be indigenous people. From there, 高山族, higher mountain people, were further categorized into either 山地山包 or 平地山包, meaning either higher mountain comrades and plains comrades. The categorized here are mostly concerned with the right to land property or voting. It has no connections to the culture of our indigenous peoples as a whole. In the general population, mountain comrades were also commonly known as 山地人, loosely translated as mountain people. Mountain people, 山地人, and the uncultivated people, 番人, have both became the symbol for uncivilization. Even since the 1980s, indigenous people's movements have flourished under the liberalization of Taiwan. Because there was a realization of how discriminatory of words uncultivated and the mountain peoples are. The early leaders then called themselves 原住民, meaning the original people who settled here. After indigenous people, 原住民 as a word started to gain traction, it gradually gained the acceptance of others who have been involved in the revolution of the Taiwanese society. In 1994, President Li Denghui used the word for the first time in the formal occasion as the leader of the country in his speech. Also in 1994, the ROC Constitution was successfully amended by replacing mountain people, 山包, with indigenous people, 原住民. In addition, in the year of 2000, the Constitution was amended again. The individual rights were replaced a group term of indigenous peoples, granting the group greater ability to establish rights in the legislative system. Yeah, the long story.
So, like indigenous peoples everywhere, indigenous peoples in Taiwan have faced a history that you've talked about of discrimination and persecution and dispossession. But we're now talking about 2020 and the coming decade. For this time, what do you see as the most important problems that are facing Taiwan indigenous people today?
From the historical lens of development of Taiwanese indigenous research, I'm trying to answer this question. In the past, most of Taiwanese anthropologists have been focused on documenting and preserving indigenous traditions, biomedical-based genes categorization, language documentation, and writing on experience that directly negatively impact the indigenous community. Indigenous people seem like a cultural specimen in this society, while their realistic living suffering is overlooked. I'm happy to see the emphasis is now put on more issues that social suffering. This includes like the indigenous education, access to health facilities, land property rights, and indigenous rights in general.
And you mentioned land property rights here. I know there's been a movement starting actually in the 1980s, Huanwada Tudi. I actually remember you and I together were at a conference that was organized by one of your classmates, Professor Taiwan Sasala. And we were walking up in the mountains in the area that had been devastated by a typhoon, and we were all yelling, Huanwa Tudi, Huanwa Tudi. What can you tell us about this movement?
I think this movement is very meaningful for indigenous people in Taiwan because the land is the most important things to indigenous community, indigenous peoples. Land is our mother, and if we don't have our land, that means we don't have the opportunity to be a person, a well-being person, or to create a harmony society. So I think the land is, I think it continues to be the issue in Taiwan right now. So we still fight for our land from government.
I think that's a great introduction. Our main topic is actually, because this is a series on Taiwan research, our main topic is indigenous research. And this was suggested by Program Director James Lin. And so I guess the first thing I'd like to ask you is, how would you define indigenous research? If someone comes to Taiwan and says, okay, I want to know about indigenous research, what is it?
Simply put, I think the indigenous research means anything that has indigenous people as a research subject in general. However, the main concern I have with defining indigenous research is the methodology. Indigenous research methodologies are based on the healthy relationship between the researchers, communities, and the participants. Taking Taiwanese indigenous community research as an example, in present time, indigenous research has noticed issue of how to represent the power of indigenous group and the knowledge, meaning how to represent indigenous people as the people who also have the ability to present their voices and our knowledge. There are also more and more indigenous researchers who have started to write on indigenous groups related issue. The central government has established a community review board, we call it the CRB, in order to do research on indigenous groups, which means if a research involves Taiwanese indigenous people, it has to be reviewed and approved by the central and or local research ethical guidelines. Now, indigenous settlements are starting to understand the right that comes with being researched. This includes being more alert when unfamiliar foreign researchers are going into indigenous communities, establishing the same idea of monitoring behaviors when researching indigenous peoples.
And if we think about this, right now, how much of the indigenous research, how many of the professional researchers are indigenous people, and how many are either Han people or foreigners? I mean, not numbers, but, what's your general impression? Who dominates the field?
I think the most of the research, indigenous researchers are Han people. Han people, yeah, and just a little portion of indigenous researchers.
At the UW, I think we've had at least, I can think of 6 Taiwanese Indigenous PhDs from the UW, from law, from social work, from anthropology, and maybe I'm forgetting some. But how do we develop a larger group of people from Indigenous communities who are taking charge of this research itself? You're not the first, but you're still kind of a pioneer. And how do you think we should, or that you should proceed to get more Indigenous people involved in research?
I think among the domestic studies, choosing an interdisciplinary, right? Choosing an interdisciplinary research topics may help Indigenous research fit into the academic in Taiwan and encourage more different discipline researcher get into the Indigenous research. For example, my colleagues and I recently proposed an integrative project focusing on the sustainability issues in Lanyu, where a tiny island beside Taiwan with most residents of Dawu people is rapidly developing the tourism industry. In our research team, there are 6 sub-projects adopting different angles such as anthropology, management, environment, ecology, and the communication network to discuss the issues of sustainability, hoping to obtain a comprehensive understanding of sustainability and to propose policy and the practice suggestions based on an Indigenous field. Regarding fitting more researchers into the Indigenous research, like from the US or other areas, I think cooperating with studying similar issues on Indigenous people, like social suffering, such as substance abuse and the psychological disorders, may help to create an academic network across borders and across the discipline.
And your research, and we'll talk more a little bit later about your individual research, but your research is mostly activist research. It's about doing research on contemporary problems. It's about cooperating with communities to address these problems. And but there's other research. For example, the historical anthropology is still going on. There's a lot of research in linguistics, I think, Austronesian linguistics. Do you see a place for this research? Is it beneficial to communities?
Mm-hmm. For few non-active research, their importance is as much as the one of active research. In my personal opinion, historical anthropology, Austronesian linguistics, and the other related research conclusions may become the foundations for some active research. For example, the research conclusions about the origins of Taiwanese people and the Austronesians explored by historical anthropologists and Austronesian linguistics scholars, respectively, are very critical when discussing the sovereignty of Taiwan. Yeah,
I think that's very important. In the 90s, in particular, a lot of Taiwanese, Green Taiwanese, the DPP people, independence-oriented people, they were all looking for something indigenous about themselves. Something to say that I'm not just Chinese, even though my ancestors came from Fujian or from Guangdong. So that this kind of use of indigenous identity as a part of Taiwan identity. Is this some kind of cultural appropriation that we should discourage, or is it good for indigenous people to be recognized as an important part of the nation? How do you feel about this?
Oh, I think this topic is very debatable in Taiwan. In Taiwan we have different party and a different or you can say nationality. So indigenous, the discourses of indigenous origins or our genes, our languages, is very important to those people who argue for our sovereignty, our nationality. So at this time, I think the Taiwanese indigenous study become a very important, also, even though it's very sensitive, but very important to be a discourse or to be an evidence that we are independent. We are not come from somewhere. We are here. We are settled here. Original settled here. Yeah.
Half of what you do is indigenous research. The other half of what you do is education. You are a professor. You're not just a researcher. And so I thought we'd like to talk a little bit about education, indigenous education, and maybe start out by what is the educational situation or educational status of indigenous populations in Taiwan.
From the census of 2018, those indigenous students who are studying in university are more likely to be in programs related to the food and the service and nursing. There is a little diversity in the programs chosen, and therefore creating a need for other higher education specializations in the community as well. Similarly, from 2014 to 2018, indigenous elimination of government sponsorship for overseas study are mostly focused on study abroad in either the United States and the United Kingdom. As for the specific area of studies, it's also extremely limited as most students choose to go into the area of education. Yeah.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about elementary and secondary education for indigenous children in Taiwan. I've been to a lot of schools, particularly in South Taiwan, where you walk into a school and we have all Paiwan designs, or Rukai designs, Bunong designs, music, dance, architecture, oral traditions, and what they call Muyujai, indigenous language education. What do you see as the benefits of these to students who go to these schools?
Traditionally, the education about indigenous people has been largely ignored, even going as far as stigmatizing indigenous groups as a whole. Currently, aside from reassessing the curriculum, current Indigenous Education Institute are attempting experimental schooling. For example, Lanyu High School take the localized education system and works Dawu cultural lessons in about 1/2 to 1/3 of its classes. These cultural classes can include how to build Dawu traditional boat, and catch flying fish skills, learning about the local mountains knowledge, and educating on age-related ceremony and traditions. In brief, learning the local culture, I think, can be helpful to indigenous peoples to fight for a variety of political rights, create the economy-aided values like the cultural tourism, and enhance the ethnicity identity and the sense of competence as well as well-being.
What about ordinary schools in Taiwan? For the 98% of the population that's not indigenous, and what do those children learn about indigenous people?
Okay, I think according to my experience, the mandatory education from elementary to high school, I don't recall a time where the curriculum would mention indigenous culture. We were not allowed to speak indigenous languages and were taught little about the Taiwanese indigenous culture. Notably, there was an impressive story in the elementary history textbook mentioned that Han resident Wu Feng sacrificed his life to cultivate Taiwanese indigenous people, not kill others. Although it was eventually found that the story is written by imagination and the description about the death of Wu Feng is contradictory to the fact, yet the uncultivated stereotype of Taiwanese indigenous people has been hard to eliminate from Han people. In the past 2 decades, the government has made some efforts on the teaching of Taiwanese indigenous people. Firstly, since 2001, I think from elementary to high school students have the opportunity to learn indigenous languages on campus. Moreover, courses related to the indigenous people emphasize the interaction among ethnic groups and the importance of diverse culture. For the curriculum guideline of the 12 years basic education, a mechanism is built for the sufficient participation of indigenous people and the transparency of the revision process. Indeed, some indigenous scholars, including my colleagues, are invited as the review committee.
So things are getting better.
Yep.
Okay.
I hope so.